Okay. All right, good afternoon. My name is Matthew Burke, and I'm going to talk to you tonight, this afternoon, this morning, whenever it is. I'm going to talk to you about debugging with NSLogger. Okay. Now, I'll give you a fair warning. I used to teach. I taught at GW for a number of years. I taught at St. Mary's College. If you teach in the university, the one thing you need to know about a person who teaches at the university is that they love to hear themselves talk. Okay. I can talk for 2 minutes, and I can talk for about 4 hours, and I have a hard time any time in between. All right, but I'm going to try and err on the short side. Since I knew I only had 15 minutes for this talk, less because I wanted to give you guys the opportunity for questions, not that there'll be any, I'm only going to give you 1 point. I could give it to you now and be done, but let's drag this out a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the context. What is logging? Why would you want to do it? When are you going to do it? I'm going to talk about some of the available tools, not all of the available tools, but some of the more popular ones, and these are all ones that I've tried at different points in time. Then I'm going to get into specifics about NSLogger, and we're going to do a live demo, which probably won't work because that's how live demos work, but we'll see. Okay. Edgar Dijkstra, very famous computer scientist, fundamental in large areas of data structures and algorithms, basically said that there shouldn't be a debugger because you should get it right the first time. You should think things through carefully before you write down the code, and you should use formal verification techniques to prove that your program is correct, and then you don't have to worry about debugging. Now, Dijkstra also said that exposure to BASIC would permanently ruin the brains of potential programmers, and I got to admit that my first programming language back in the day was BASIC, TRS-80, in when? Like the early 1980s. So, I like this quote by Brian Kernighan about debugging instead. The most effective debugging technique is the well-placed print statement. Mark Dalrymple, if you're familiar with him, talks about caveman debugging. NSLogger is, I think, an improvement on caveman debugging, but let's reserve judgment. Okay. Now, let me just briefly say that logging is not just about debugging, even though I've been talking about that. I've been talking as if it was, and I'm going to continue to talk as if they are the same. But let me just briefly mention there are a lot of other reasons why you might want to do logging. Monitoring of systems, gathering statistics about the performance of the system or the usage of a system. You might want to do logging for various auditing purposes. For error recovery, logging is really important if you've got a long-running process, say a web server that is going to fail every month or so. You don't want to have it fail and then wait another month to try and figure out why it failed. If you're recording as much information as you possibly can, you've got a better chance of addressing the situation. But anyway, let's just talk about logging, and let's talk about logging in the context of debugging. Logging is useful for a lot of things. It lets us know where we are in the program when a bug occurs. It lets us know what the relevant state was. What are the values of the IVARs of whatever object that we're accessing. It lets me verify that my IB outlets are wired correctly in an iPhone, in an iOS setting. Did the notification that I was expecting actually fire? Again, in the iPhone world, is my KVO working the way I want it to? Okay? And there's an important point here. It's not that I'm worried that KVO isn't going to work. Okay? There's an old saying among Unix hands that the socket routines don't have the bug. Okay? And the idea is that, well, you know, I mean, they might. I mean, their software, just like any other software, they might have the bug, but 99.999, and let's throw on a couple more 9% of the time, the bugs are in your stuff. But your inclination is that the bugs are in somebody else's stuff. And so the point that I want to try and get across with this talk is I think the more information that you have at hand when you're trying to debug a situation, the more likely it is that you're going to easily be able to get past that ego stuff of, no, it's got to be somebody else's stuff. It's not my stuff's fine. The more information you have, the quicker you're going to be able to zero in on what's actually going on or what's not going on. Okay. So in other words, there's this tension, okay? I just said you want to have lots and lots of information. The more information you have, the better. Except that's not true. The more information you have, then you've got all this information, and it's like, now what? Okay, so there's this dilemma between too little and too much information when you're doing debugging. Okay, put that on hold for a second. Let's talk briefly about tools. NSLog, okay? NSLog is arguably the best debugging tool you have. Why? Because you don't have to do anything to use it. You just have to throw in some NSLog statements, okay? Now, you can get really fancy and you can wrap, and again, I'm sort of biased towards the iPhone side of things. They're equivalent in Android and I assume other systems as well. You just throw the statement in. You can get fancy. You can wrap things up in a macro so that you can easily provide additional information like what line, what function, what file, that kind of stuff that the message was triggered by. You can wrap things up in a macro so that the debugging statements always disappear when you go to build a release bug. Sorry, release version. Okay?
A buggy release.
There you go. Okay. But let's see what else we've got. So I jumped the gun a little bit. Macro wrapped NSLog. Log for Cocoa. How many of you guys do Java programming at all? How many of you have heard of Log4j? Okay, so Log4j was a logging package for Java. It's quite popular. I think, at least it was quite popular. I think it's been superseded these days. I haven't done a lot of Java programming recently. Log for Cocoa is taking that Java library and porting it into Cocoa and trying to get the same type of behavior in a Cocoa app that you had in Java. So one of the interesting things about Log4j, and one of the things that Log for Cocoa allows you to do, is it allows you to configure your logging, what level of logging, what circumstances trigger logging, what information is provided. It lets you configure that so that it varies depending on the class of the object that's throwing the logging message. It's really very elegant. It uses a lot of the dynamic features of Objective-C to allow you to do this configuration. It's got a number of different interesting ways of configuring the system. I worked with it for a long time. I really wanted to like it, but what happened is I found myself just using NSLog all the time because it was just overhead to get this installed and configured. And then I spent a lot of time trying to play around with the configuration and tune the configuration. And I found myself going back over and over again to NSLog because I could just stick it in and I was done. Cocoa Lumberjack is another package, and this is a pretty popular package. It gives you a lot of the same flexibility as Log for Cocoa, but I think it's a lot simpler, it's a lot more straightforward. And it's got some nice features as well. For example, Cocoa Lumberjack makes use of GCD for running a separate queue for sending the logging messages. So there's almost no overhead whatsoever in throwing this into your system and having it do lots of logging. Cocoa Lumberjack is nice if you're in a situation where you want to keep the logging code in the release version. So particularly if you're doing an enterprise app, you might be more inclined to do something like that. And then there's NSLogger. I tried Cocoa Lumberjack for a while, and I liked it too, but again, it was a little bit too much work to get it involved, and I'm fairly lazy, and so I kept going back to NSLog. But I found NSLogger. Now remember what I said. I said there's this dilemma, there's this tension between having too little information and having too much information when you're trying to debug. The reason why I really like NSLogger is because it gives me a solution, which is just log the hell out of the system. Okay? Log every single thing you can think of that might possibly be relevant. Because what NSLogger does is it gives you all kinds of great capability for filtering all of those log statements so that you can key in on just what it is that's relevant to your task at hand. Okay. Now let me take a little bit of a tangent here at this point. There's one other big dilemma, I think, with logging statements, and this is something I was discussing this with Mark Dalrymple fairly recently at another conference, and that's the issue of whether you take your log statements back out after you've solved the problem, or whether you leave them in. And Mark is very firmly in the camp of, you've got a problem, you stick in some logging statements, you figure out what the problem is, and then you take them back out. Mainly because if you've got all these logging statements in your code, that's a lot of visual clutter. It makes it harder to see your code. And you could argue the harder it is to read through your code and see what's going on, the easier it is to introduce bugs. So maybe it's kind of self-defeating. I like leaving them in, at least leaving them in for a long time until I've gotten a section of code that I'm really, really confident in. Maybe it's just a lack of confidence on my part, but just all the time I'm finding things surprising me. And it's useful if I've already been collecting data rather than now I've got to back up, stick logging statements in, and then try and figure out what's going on. Personally, I think the solution is better tools. Okay, I think the solution is what we want to develop a capability in our IDE so that we can stick the logging statements in and then have the IDE hide them from us unless we specifically want to see them. But like I said, that's a tangent. Okay. What does NSLogger give you? Okay, first of all, it's a separate, it's a client-server system, essentially. Okay, there's a small client library that you stick in your project. You send out the logging statements, and the logging statements are dispatched out over the ether, and a viewer application collects them. And then you can save the log files on a different machine. Okay. Turns out there's a client library for both iOS and Android. I'd forgotten that there was a library for Android. I've recently been doing some Android programming, and I was thinking, you know what, I like NSLogger so much, I think I'm going to write a client library for Android. And then, luckily, I decided I'd look at the source again and thought, oh, there's one already. The client connects to the viewer either via Bonjour, so zero configuration networking, for those of you not in the iOS camp, or you can do it over TCP. The client buffers messages until it makes a connection to the viewer. So one of the problems you have with a client server solution for doing logging messages is the client starts up, and what if something immediately goes wrong? Unless it's super severe, you're still okay because the messages are all buffered. Eventually the connection comes through, and then the messages can be flushed to the viewer application. NSLogger allows you to log several different types of information. You can send simple text messages or parameterized text messages, but you can also send binary data, which is useful for debugging networking problems. You can send images, which is really cool, although I've not actually found a use for it. I think one place where it might be useful, going back to my point about the important thing about debugging is verifying that everything that you've assumed is actually true. It might be useful if you're doing some sort of image work with images or image processing or something like that. It might be nice to verify that the application has got the images that you think the application has, particularly if you're downloading things over the net or something like that. And then the viewing application, the server application, allows you to stick markers in the flow of messages that you're getting from the application. Okay. NSLogger allows you to collect a lot of context about the logging messages you're getting, including the file, the class, the method, where they were triggered, when they were triggered. The viewer calculates the time between messages, which can be useful if you're debugging synchronization issues. And it's really easy to use. Okay. They're 3 Objective-C files, similar on Android. You add them to your project, and you're ready to go. Okay. Once you've got the client files, the client library included in your application to actually use it, it's pretty easy. It works a lot like NSLog. You can get fancy and clean things up with macros if you want to. So suppose you've got, you want to separate out messages for networking versus messages for database access versus messages for whatever. You can create macros to make it visually a little bit more clear in your source code what's going on. I tend not to do that though. By the way, I should point out with this log message command here, what we've got is we've got some sort of tag. So here I'm using some sort of constant called networking tag, but the tag we're going to see you use for filtering. So it can be anything you want. Typically I use it to, again, indicate which section, which module of my application. NSLogger doesn't impose any sort of preconceived ideas on logging level, so that's what this next one is, verbose level. It's just their integers, and you can assign them whatever semantics you want, and then you can filter by them. And then essentially we've got a variadic function, so we can pass a string, and then we can substitute parameters and integers and et cetera into that string. Okay. All right, so let's switch to the app real quickly. Now here's the part, let's see if this actually works. I tried it earlier and it didn't actually work on the network here. I think the ports are blocked, but what I've done is I've got an app on my iPad which just randomly generates logging messages. I've created a network off this machine, and it's not working. Let me just just got to get the right IP number here. For some reason I couldn't get the Bungie networking to work either, but this should do it.
That's all the Android devices in the room.
Alright, that's not working, so we've got a backup here. Okay, so it would be obviously more impressive if it was coming from my iPad, but here we are, I'm running this app on my simulator, and all it's doing is just randomly sending messages. And here's the viewer application that I'm running on my laptop. Okay. So it gives me lots of good stuff. Okay, so here are the messages, and as I mentioned, I can get text, I can get images, I can get binary data. By the way, essentially what it's doing is it's serializing an NS dictionary and sending that across, so you could customize it and add your own types if you wanted to. I haven't really thought of a reason for doing it yet.
You mean like you add like plugins to NSLogger, the viewer? Or
It's not really, wouldn't really necessarily be plugins, but it's open source, so you could extend it if you wanted. Okay, so I can filter by tag. So for example, I only want to see database messages. There are no database messages. I only want to see image messages. Apparently there are none of those as well. Why is it? Yeah, all the, this is, oh, yeah, thank you. Let's go back to, there we go. So now, so here are the network messages, and again, this is that first parameter to the log function. It's a string tag that I can use to do my own classification. So I can sort, I can get the network messages, I can get messages related to audio. I can get messages related to audio that have a severity of 2 or less, which is apparently all of them, that have a severity of exactly 0. So I've got multiple ways to filter, and I can create my own custom ways. So I can filter based on message type. I can filter based on what the message contains. So I can look for a particular text string in the message, the tag. I can filter based on thread. Okay. So all of these are coming off the main thread. That's just because of the way that the demo app here is written. But if I had a multi-threaded app, I could log from the different threads, and I can filter by those threads.
Does it automatically capture thread info, or do you have to pump that in?
No, the logging functions on the client side actually automatically capture the thread information. Okay. So at this point, I'm way over time. So let me just end with one summary. Again, I just want to repeat this point. Debugging is tough, and the more information you have, the easier it is to solve the problem. Mainly, I think one of the biggest problems with debugging, one of the things that makes it complicated, is that frequently you make assumptions that aren't true, and then you spend a lot of time trying to solve the issue until you finally go back and question your assumptions. And I think the more information you can collect, the quicker you get to that point where you examine your assumptions. And I think NSLogger is a really powerful tool for helping with that, because it solves that dilemma of collecting lots of information but not swamping you with it. All right, I apologize for going over time. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you've had a good conference.